Hello, and welcome back to the Fabric of Industry Podcast, Episode 10, an economic overview of the world. I'm your host, Adam Grange. Moving into setting up for an exploration of the secondary sector of industry, I thought it would be a good idea to give an overview of various indicators of economic success in different regions around the world based on the level of development present. This could be seen as an activity tying together what we have learned so far on economics. And I want to be clear, this is going to be a fact and number heavy episode. But I don't expect this stuff to be memorized or anything. I just want us to have an idea in the backs of our heads of the economic and developmental success in various sectors of industry in various regions across the globe. So, when a country or a region is mentioned in the future, when I bring one up, we can immediately think of the ranges of economic development that exists there. As to not make this an insanely long and dry episode, I'll be looking at 3 key factors in each region. And importantly, not going over every single country in the world, as even I would get tired of that. I've separated the globe into 13 relatively distinct regions, with the last one sort of encompassing a grab bag of sorts. The human development indices for the countries in each region are close enough together that I think they work as distinct regions. They are also as geographically close together as I could get them without compromising the HDI rank too much. Because of this, the average incomes are going to be relatively close for each country per region. But of course, the GDP will vary drastically, since that is dependent mostly on total population. And population is a statistic I'll mention quite a bit, but I'm not requiring it as a necessary for this episode, as it changes perhaps the quickest out of the others. Regardless, these are the statistics I will be going over for each region. That is the HDI, the Human Development Index, GDP, Gross Domestic Product, and GDP per capita, as well as the typical sector of industry countries within the region focus on, with some specific examples of specific prominent industries. A couple notes on this before I continue. The HDI rankings I am pulling from the 2023 Human Development Report from the United Nations, as it's the most comprehensive we have right now. I will also only be using the current nominal GDP statistics, not the purchasing power parity, or PPP GDP statistics. Both of these statistics are in US dollars, however. I explain this and why I only use nominal GDP here in this podcast in episode 6 on macroeconomics, if you're so inclined to listen to that to understand why. These statistics, the GDP statistics, are drawn from the 2025 International Monetary Fund, or IMF. Most of them, at least. This may get a little dry, like I said, so if you don't like straight statistics, you can totally skip this episode, but I'll try to make it entertaining as well. There is no recommended pre-listening, although episode 5 on the Human Development Index and episode 6 on macroeconomics, as I mentioned, could be of use. This will also be an episode I recommend listening to for all future content, as to have a general knowledge of world economic statistics, it's a good thing to have, I think. Though I'll never recommend this episode as specific pre-listening. And a slight caveat there, since I have tried to, as much as possible, and will try to continue making this podcast have timeless content. This episode, meaning, you can listen to it at 30 years in the future or whatever, and it still have relevance. This episode itself may have to be updated in a decade or so, if I'm hopefully still making episodes by then, as the information in this episode may be completely outdated. We don't really know. I mean, it won't go, crazy in any direction. Countries won't have quadrupled their GDP or something, but, in some cases, it might be the case. So we just don't know. So that is another reason it won't be strictly necessary to have listened to this episode before other episodes as pre-listening material. Anyway, that's plenty of preamble, so let's begin. I'll start off with describing my 13 regions, listing some key countries within each as I go. Just be aware that I did come up with these regions myself. These aren't regions that really exist in the literature anywhere. Hopefully, though, you'll see the geographic consistency, and as I begin to discuss the statistics for each region, you'll see the overall consistency. I'll go from relatively the highest developed regions to the lowest, and then save my grab bag for last, or grab bag for the last region. Although one more caveat, again, I have not categorized these regions as to make anyone feel bad. This is supposed to be a scientific, economic, statistics-based podcast. Especially, if you find your country in the grab bag, if you live in a country that I've placed in the grab bag, these are just regions I discerned myself to be the best fitting for our purposes. So, apologies if I have upset you, but it's not my intention. Anyway, in no particular order because of general descending development levels, North America is our first region, which simply includes Canada and the United States. Next, we have Western Europe. This has all the quintessential European countries one may think of first. The United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, all the Scandinavian countries, including Iceland and Greenland, which technically isn't a sovereign country because it actually belongs to Denmark. We end at Poland, sort of draw a line at the eastern border of Poland, and then go down to the Czech Republic and Slovenia, and then Greece is sort of disconnected, but I'm going to include it in Western Europe because of its statistics. Then we have what I'll call developed Asia, which is Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong, which, yes, the latter is its own country ranked on the HDI. Then we have another two-country region of just Australia and New Zealand, which I may just refer to as Australia, so sorry, New Zealand, but just remember you're included. So that makes the four very highly developed regions, where pretty much all of the countries, most of the countries, are very highly developed. Actually, all of the countries I've included, I believe, are highly developed on the Human Development Index. So we have North America, Western Europe, developed Asia, and Australia and New Zealand. I'll also sort of include a region I'm calling the Arabian Peninsula, as the countries here are rather new in terms of being highly developed, but I think, again, all of them are considered highly developed on the Human Development Index. This is a strange region, though, because the countries here are surrounded by underdeveloped countries. But since it is most of the Arabian Peninsula, I'm going to refer to this region as such. This will include Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait. I'm also going to include Israel here, as it is closer to these countries in human development than other Middle Eastern countries. Though that may not be the smartest political decision, but that doesn't matter for us. Anyway, moving north, we have Eastern Europe, which is the Slavic world, including Latvia, Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine, and, of course, Russia. And then the Balkans, including Croatia, Hungary, Bosnia, Serbia, and others. And I'm also placing Turkey here, as it's closer to these, statistics-wise, than countries in West Asia and Central Asia. And one note on Russia, I suppose. I believe most people pretty much categorize all of Russia in Asia itself, but most of the people who live in Russia live in Western Russia, which is closer to Europe than it is to Asia, and of course they share a lot of cultural background with the rest of the Slavic world and even most of Europe as compared to Eastern Asia. Speaking of Asia, though, our next region is, I'm going to call it East Asia. Of course, China is here, but we also have Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, and actually, Malaysia could probably go with developed Asia, but I'm just going to put it here. And Sri Lanka I'll also consider here. Our final highly developed region will then be Latin America. Well, again, these aren't, super segregated in the sense of being very highly developed, highly medium. So I won't necessarily continue to categorize them as such, but we'll say our next region will be Latin America. And that makes, 9 regions so far, or 8 regions? Latin America includes all of South America, most of Central America, and also most of the Caribbean. But I will mention which countries do not fit here when I go over the grab bag countries. And Mexico, I'm also going to put here. For our next region, we have North Africa, which includes Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, even though the last two aren't on the actual African continent. Again, statistics-wise, they fit better here, and geographically, they're relatively close. West Asia includes, this could also be Central Asia, but I'll do West Asia. I think most of the population lives more to the west. Anyway, this includes Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iran, and then most of the stands: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. I'm also putting Mongolia here, even though it's geographically segregated. Southeast Asia includes Myanmar, or Burma, but I'll refer to it as Myanmar, Laos, the Philippines, Indonesia, and pretty much all of the island nations in the Oceania subregions of Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. Ones you may have heard of here, these island nations, could be Fiji and the Maldives, although the Maldives is more highly developed. Also included here is the Indian subcontinent, with India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal. Pakistan will not be going here, even though it is in the Indian subcontinent. Now on to the low-developed regions. The major one here is Sub-Saharan Africa. It's really the only low-developed region in the world. This includes almost all of the entire African continent, though, excluding South Africa, Botswana, and Gabon, which go into our grab bag. Some countries you may have heard here include Chad, Niger, the Congo, Kenya, Sudan, and South Sudan, and Somalia. I'm also going to place Yemen here, since it is geographically very close to Sub-Saharan Africa. It could also go in our grab bag, but again, they share a good amount of cultural and religious ties to some of Eastern Africa. And then that leaves us with our grab bag. So most of the countries here are fairly underdeveloped. Those ones are in fairly developed regions, but they're kind of isolated, underdeveloped countries. Some of the exceptions here are what I mentioned earlier: South Africa, Botswana, and Gabon. Since they are developing countries, but they're in an underdeveloped region. Also, there are various island nations around the world, which I'm going to put here for one reason or another, but I probably won't be mentioning any of them specifically. I probably won't be mentioning most island nations specifically, and I'll explain that a bit later on. Other countries that fit the bill of underdevelopment in a developed or developing region include Haiti in Latin America, Afghanistan in West Asia, Iraq and Syria in the Arabian Peninsula, and Pakistan, as I said earlier, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and some other islands in Oceania, like I said, which would have otherwise been categorized in Southeast Asia. So to summarize and go over the 13 regions again, we have North America, Western Europe, Developed Asia, Australia and New Zealand, the Arabian Peninsula, Eastern Europe, East Asia, Latin America, North Africa, West Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and then our grab bag. Please note, before we dive into the rest of the episode, that, again, these are fairly rough categories, as, for example, Southeast Asia includes the Philippines with a Human Development Index of 0.720, and Southeast Asia also includes Cambodia with a Human Development Index of 0.606, which is a pretty big range. But some regions do have tighter ranges. Of course, usually the smaller number of countries that are in a region, they'll have a tighter range. Like North America has Canada with a Human Development Index of 0.939, and the United States with a Human Development Index of 0.938, and then no other countries there. But there is, just not really any other countries that can fit in North America. As Mexico is really the only country that's geographically close, and it has a Human Development Index of 0.789, and so we can't realistically put that here based off of my criteria. Anyway, North America is actually a good place for us to begin, as it's a very highly developed region, and it only has those two countries, so it'll be relatively simple. As I just stated, North America includes only two countries, Canada and the United States. These countries have human development indices of 0.939 and 0.938 and are ranked 16 and 17 in the world, respectively. This, of course, means they are both highly developed. Very highly developed. If you haven't listened to episode 5 on the Human Development Index, very highly developed means the life expectancy, average years of schooling, and income per capita are all very high. In this episode, as it's an economic overview, I'll only be discussing the latter that is income per capita in the form of GDP per capita and then total GDP sometimes. Canada has a GDP per capita of 54,935, which is dollars, which is 23rd in the world, and the United States has a GDP per capita of $89,599, making it 8th in the world. The United States also has the largest GDP in the world. This is, of course, in U.S. dollars. As I was saying, the United States has the largest GDP in the world for a country at a staggering $30.616 trillion. I'm sure most people know that it's very large. Canada has a nominal GDP of $2.284 trillion, so still very large. That's 10th in the world, but as you can see, there's quite a bit of a difference there, about $28 trillion, and that's mostly due to population. The United States has a population of over 340 million, while Canada has around 42 million. The real estate industry is the largest single industry for both countries, making up about 13% of each country's GDP. Real estate is an industry considered to be in the tertiary sector. It's a service. Both countries also see significant activity in the quaternary and quinary sectors, which leaves activity in the primary and secondary sectors quite low. Again, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, we will see this trend a lot. And also because even though the real estate industries are massive in both of these countries, they're only about 13% of the total GDP. There's 87% of the rest of the GDP that's spread across different industries, different economic sectors. And so that makes an economy very highly developed. And I will discuss that a little later on, I think, once I get to the Arabian Peninsula. So with North America being quick and easy and out of the way, we now get to one of the most complex regions with Western Europe. There are 26 countries, I believe, I've included in this region, if I count it correctly, so I will, of course, not be going over each one. What I will do for these larger regions is take the highest and the lowest statistic for each category to give us a range, and then I'll sort of do the three, at least parenthetically, what I personally feel to be the three quintessential, most thought-about countries, and give the largest industry for each. I may not do three for each region. We'll see how we go. The most developed country in the world is a Western European country, though I'm not sure they would consider themselves as such, but remember, I'm trying to keep the number of total regions low by including probably many countries that wouldn't call themselves Western European or Arabian or whatever else. These aren't cultural demarcations I've made. Anyway, Iceland has a Human Development Index of 0.972, which is the most developed country in the world, as per the Human Development Index. And there are actually 8 of the top 10 most developed countries in the world in this region. Poland is the least developed country I've placed in this region, and it still has a very high Human Development Index of 0.906. Western Europe is an interesting case, though, for average income, because there are quite a few tax haven countries where a lot of very wealthy people live but don't necessarily generate the money for the country. And they don't even necessarily have to live here. I'll explain the tax haven a little bit more on, because there's a couple a little bit further on, because there's a couple in developed Asia too, so we can sort of encompass all of them once I get through them all. Just be aware that the tax havens make the statistics a little weird. So I'll still give the top and the bottom, but I'll also throw in a couple more realistic numbers. Liechtenstein is actually the second richest country in the world by GDP per capita. The first is Monaco. And the figure here is $231,713. With a GDP of $9.424 billion, that makes it the population of this country only about 40,000. So it's got one of the smallest nominal GDPs in the world, but the second highest GDP per capita in the world. Greece runs in with the lowest GDP per capita with $27,170. Now for a couple more realistic ones, though, after Liechtenstein. The first one I'll choose is Germany because the country actually has the largest GDP in Western Europe and the third largest in the world at over 5 trillion, a little bit over 5 trillion. With a population of about 83 million, that puts the GDP per capita at a more realistic $60,000. Real estate is once again the largest industry in terms of contribution to GDP for Germany, but automobiles are the largest share of manufacturing, as one might assume. Switzerland is another that I'll list, as the country is very highly developed. I think it's second in the world, but it still has a nominal GDP of over 1 trillion, which makes for about 111,000 per capita. The smallest nominal GDP for a Western European country that isn't including very small states in the tax havens is Greece, again, with a figure of 282 billion and a GDP per capita of, like I said earlier, 27,000. Switching it up from real estate, however, Greece's largest share of GDP comes from tourism, which is, again, a tertiary sector activity, but it is a staggering 30-ish% of the entire GDP. So now moving halfway across the globe, we get to go over another small region that is of developed Asia. So we can finish our tax haven discussion here. I don't think I mentioned it earlier either, but I separated these 4 countries, that is Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore, from other Asian regions because they are the only 4 countries in Asia considered to be developed. So I figured going with developed Asia would be more descriptive than something arbitrary like East Asia 1 and 2. However, this is also effectively another 2-country region for us because Hong Kong and Singapore are also tax havens. So now that we've kind of listed most of the tax haven countries, I'll explain it a little further for us. So tax haven essentially represents its GDP as overinflated because the country's economy is used by the ultra-rich for moving money through the economy to evade taxes and whatnot, which can be an entirely political discussion, so I won't go further into that. Just understand what it means. And what that means for us is the GDP per capita of these tax haven countries is usually vastly overrepresented. For example, I said the GDP per capita of Liechtenstein is 231,000. But if you travel to Liechtenstein and ask someone how much they make, they're most likely not going to say $200,000. They're probably going to say something like $60,000 or $80,000, or something a little more realistic for figures in that region. So that also goes for Hong Kong and Singapore as well, which are both considered tax haven countries. Some of the other tax haven countries, as I said, the rest of them are in Europe. We have Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands. Ireland itself, I think, is actually considered one. And then I think the British Virgin Islands are too. So as I said, for developed Asia, it's effectively a 2-country region. So we'll just discuss both Japan and South Korea. South Korea is actually one of the more recent countries to be considered developed, I believe, as it has a Human Development Index of 0.937, and it's increased very rapidly. Japan is not far off with a Human Development Index of 0.925. South Korea has a GDP of about 1.8 trillion, and with a population of 52 million, the GDP per capita lands at about 36,000. Japan, on the other hand, has the 4th largest GDP in the world at almost 4.3 trillion, but with a much larger population of 123 million, the GDP per capita lands around South Korea with almost 35,000. As is probably known, South Korea is a semiconductor giant, and electronics and semiconductors indeed are the largest industry. South Korea, alongside Japan, is also known for automobiles, and that makes up a significant portion of both countries' economies. Both of these industries are manufacturing, though, which is partially why South Korea is so newly developed, because services have not taken over as the dominant sector. In Japan, though, the case is different, as over 70% of its GDP is in services. This includes tourism, finance, information technology, entertainment, and of course, real estate, others as well. Our final region of developed countries include Australia and New Zealand. Australia is the seventh most developed country in the world by terms of the HDI, with an index of 0.958. New Zealand is also very highly developed, with an HDI of 0.938. That ties the United States. So as you can see, or listen to, I guess, every developed country in the world is at least above a 0.900 on the Human Development Index. This is not necessarily what makes a country developed, but it is a good indicator. Anyway, Australia has a GDP of 1.8 trillion and a GDP per capita of about 66,000, with a population of 28 million. New Zealand has a GDP of 263 billion, but with a smaller population of 5.3 million, the GDP per capita is relatively comparable to Australia at $46,000. Unsurprisingly, real estate is the largest single industry in both countries, but mining is also a significant part of Australia's GDP, and perhaps surprisingly, dairy is New Zealand's largest export commodity, making agriculture a significant part of their GDP. Moving on to a still highly developed region of the world, but one that actually isn't considered mostly to be developed. I hope that's not confusing, but let's talk about the Arabian Peninsula. This is an interesting part of the world, as the United Arab Emirates is the sole country to have moved up in the Human Development Index as quickly as it has in the past decade. There are others that have moved up or down quite rapidly, but the UAE is much quicker. It has moved up an impressive 27 ranks. Saudi Arabia has also moved up 9 ranks in the same time. Respectively, the UAE has an HDI of 0.940 and is 15th in the world, and Saudi Arabia has an HDI of 0.900. This makes these two countries very highly developed. Kuwait has the lowest HDI in this region at 0.852. It is a little funny to me now that I think about it, saying the lowest, like 0.852 is lower or something. Anyway, Kuwait also has the smallest GDP at 157 billion, and a GDP per capita of almost 31,000. The largest region is Saudi Arabia, by GDP, also by land area, but by GDP, Saudi Arabia sits at 1.25 trillion, with a GDP per capita of a little over 35,000. You can see the incomes are pretty comparable to the countries in Asia that we went over. So if you were thinking the oil-producing countries make everyone in the country rich, that isn't the case for the majority of the population. Now, that isn't to say an average income of over 30,000 is poor, but it certainly isn't the case that everyone is a millionaire because they live in a top oil-producing country. But of course, the largest share of the GDP by far in all of these countries in this region is oil and gas. This, of course, presents a problem for these countries, like I mentioned earlier, with how developed countries are established. This is a major reason why these are not considered developed countries, even though their incomes are high and they live long and are well educated, among other indicators. The economies in the Arabian Peninsula are what we would call not advanced. This means that they're not well diversified and they're unstable. Since the economy of Kuwait relies on over 90% of exports from oil, it is not advanced, and that makes it difficult to call the country developed. Again, this is the case for most countries in the Arabian Peninsula, which included Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, and Bahrain. The only real exception here is the United Arab Emirates, because the largest industry is the real estate industry, which is relatively recent, and that is led by the city of Dubai. Oil and gas are still the largest export, but it doesn't account for such a massive portion of the total GDP of the UAE as it does for other Arabian countries. If you remember when I was talking about the United States and Canada, 13% about of their GDP is made up from the real estate industry, with 87% scattered around other industries. That makes their economies very well diverse, which can make them advanced economies. which is an indicator of a country being developed. Next, we'll travel to Eastern Europe. This is a politically difficult region of the world, so please remember I'm not separating these regions based on anything besides countries in a certain range of HDI that are geographically close. We're now past any regions that are small in number of countries, pretty much, as Eastern Europe contains 18 countries. Our highest HDI is Estonia at 0.905, and the lowest is the Ukraine with an HDI of 0.779. Interestingly, the Ukraine is also one of the fastest declining countries. That gives us a total range, though, of 0.126, which is our largest so far. Also, interestingly, there are only 3 countries considered developed in this region, and that would be Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. However, there are some economic powerhouses in Eastern Europe. Turkey is one of the largest by GDP, with a figure of 1.5 trillion. The country, however, has an enormous population of over 85 million, which puts the GDP per capita at around 18,000. So you can see how quickly we're declining in the GDP per capita. Russia is probably the country most people want to hear about in this section, I would think, and by GDP has the largest economy. Russia has a nominal GDP of 2.54 trillion. With a population of 146 million, though, that makes the GDP per capita land around 17,000, so again, around Turkey. Most of the other Eastern European countries are fairly small, but run with similar GDP per capita. North Macedonia, I believe, has the smallest out of the countries I've chosen, with a GDP of 18.78 billion, and a relatively similar GDP per capita of almost 11,000, similar to the other countries I listed. Russia is probably well known as a massive oil and gas exporter, and much like the Arabian Peninsula countries, relies far too much on the export of oil for the economy to be considered advanced. Agriculture is also huge in most of these countries. However, North Macedonia is a bit of a different case. Even though it has the smallest GDP out of this section, the largest share of its GDP is in services. This might seem a bit strange based on the trends we've been seeing with income compared to the largest types of industry, but tourism is massive in Macedonia, which, if you think about it, it makes sense because it shares much of the tourism that people travel to Greece for. East Asia is perhaps one of the regions a lot of you will be most interested in because of China. Probably most people are aware of how large China's economy is, and also probably how large the population is. But before I give those figures, let's get a better scope of what I mean by East Asia. This, of course, does not include all of East Asia or Southeast Asia or South Asia or, the Asian continent, as, I think those are typically the names applied to the entire region, the geographic region at least, and cultural region. This was probably the most difficult region for me to split up based on my criteria, particularly because of the Southeast Indochina Peninsula, where Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, etc. are. This is a fairly tight region where the countries mostly run north to south and are skinny, and they basically flip back and forth from highly developed to medium and back and forth. So the point I'm trying to make here is that I had to choose, essentially, the higher developed countries to fit into the region where I placed China, and the lower developed countries in the region where I placed India. So hence East Asia and Southeast Asia, because we'll say China is kind of our flagship country for East Asia, and India is kind of our flagship country for Southeast Asia. So East Asia includes China, of course, but also Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, as I said, and Sri Lanka. I've also put the higher developed island countries in Oceania here, which include countries such as Palau, the Maldives, and Tonga. Since there are so many island countries, though, and their economic contributions are decidedly small compared to the larger mainland countries in this region, I won't be discussing them further, and that will be the case for pretty much for island countries moving forward. The country with the highest HDI here is actually Malaysia, with an HDI of 0.819. China has an HDI of 0.797, which is rapidly increasing. The lowest out of what I listed is Sri Lanka with an HDI of 0.776. China, of course, has the largest economy and population by far, second in the world for both. China's nominal GDP is a staggering 19.4 trillion, with a population of 1.408 billion. This makes for our first country I've mentioned that is under the world average GDP per capita, which is currently $14,217. China has a GDP per capita of 13,806. I realized in editing this that I straight up lied to all of you, because China was not the first country that I mentioned that has an average GDP per capita below the world average. That was actually North Macedonia that I just mentioned in Eastern Europe, because their GDP per capita is about 11,000. So just a quick note here, and we can get back to the episode. Malaysia actually has a higher GDP per capita of 13,901. The smallest GDP in this region, again discounting island countries, is Sri Lanka at 99 billion, with a GDP per capita of about 4,300. So you can see the ranges here are starting to get a little bigger, and we're decreasing in GDP per capita even quicker. The other countries here are all around a half a trillion in GDP, roughly, with a similar GDP per capita to China. Just to give perspective of the island countries, though, so I don't just, skip over them completely, Palau has an HDI of 0.786, so closer to Sri Lanka than to, Malaysia, but it has a GDP of about 341 million. That's million with an M. We've only been talking about trillion and billion so far. And because it has a population of only 18,000, the GDP per capita is about 19,000. Back to China, though, really quick, something that may come as a surprise is that over half of China's GDP is derived from services, which is partially part of the reason why it's increasing in development so quickly. This services is, of course, a tertiary sector. I think most people think China makes pretty much all of their money from manufacturing, and they mostly do light manufacturing. And while it is an enormous part of it, services do actually make up the largest part. This is also the case for Sri Lanka, though textile manufacturing is almost as large of a part of the GDP. And that's just textile manufacturing, not all manufacturing. On to perhaps the largest region. Maybe largest, maybe not. We have Latin America. Sub-Saharan Africa might be larger by number of countries. It's certainly larger by landmass, I think, but I figured it didn't matter too much to discern that since I'm only mentioning a few countries. Well, Africa, it's the largest continent behind Asia, but I suppose I'll have to make a separate podcast for geography. I probably won't end up doing that. Okay, you know what? Let me figure it out quickly. Okay, after some rough calculations, our region of Sub-Saharan Africa is larger than any other region by several million square miles. And remember, this region doesn't include the largest North African countries. But before either of those regions, so as to not confuse us further, let's do Latin America. This is still an enormous region, though, with way too many countries to list. This might be our largest range of human development indices, though. I think it'll still end up being Sub-Saharan Africa, but we'll see. So I'll give a few more, besides just the highest and lowest. The reason I put all of South and most of Central America and the Caribbean together is because there are only a few countries that have a very high HDI, and they're spread out geographically, unlike the 4 countries that I listed in developed Asia. They're all relatively close to each other. You can kind of draw a circle, and then they're all included in that circle. That's not the case for these countries in Latin America. Most countries here are highly developed, and the real low outliers that I placed into the grab bag, well, there's actually only one. Anyway, Chile and Argentina are our highest on the Human Development Index, with indices of 0.878 and 0.865 respectively. The middle of the pack falls around where Mexico and Brazil are, with indices of 0.789 and 0.786 respectively. So already quite a range, but most of the countries fall around here and around the lowest. Some of the lowest here are Guatemala and Honduras, with indices of 0.662 and 0.645. So we see some 8s, some 7s, and some 6s here. So our range here goes from Chile as the highest of 0.878 to Honduras at the lowest with 0.645, and that makes a range of 0.233. So pretty big. If we take out the few top countries, which would be about 4 of the over 30 countries here, then the range drops to 0.194, which is certainly a bit tighter. Still pretty big range, though. Again, I could have maybe split this up into 2 regions, but with 2 of the most developed countries at the bottom of South America and the other 2 high up in the Caribbean, they're just too scattered geographically. So I think it's okay. This is also a fairly cohesive region as far as culture and history go, as compared to, the rest of the world. Since we have quite a few small islands in the Caribbean here as well, I'll be excluding them from GDP figures since they would not be giving much of an accurate range of incomes in Latin America. Brazil is the largest by GDP by quite a margin, at a figure of 2.25 trillion, with one of the largest populations in the world with 213 million people. The GDP per capita lands at around 10,000. On the lower end, we have figures around El Salvador, with a GDP of 37.8 billion and a GDP per capita of almost 6,000. Argentina, being one of the most developed here, has a GDP of 683.5 billion and with a population of almost 47 million, a GDP per capita of about 14,000. By share of GDP, services actually lead in Brazil, but agricultural products are the top export. The story is the same for El Salvador, though textiles and apparel replace agriculture for the top export. So as you can see, based off of those GDP per capita numbers, you have Argentina at 14,000, Brazil at 10,000, El Salvador at 6,000. That kind of gives us our range here. The range isn't super big, so since this is more of an economic overview, I think it's okay to be including, Chile, Argentina, those higher developed countries that probably do have higher incomes in this region, because they're not super far off. Our next region that we'll move on to is North Africa. There are only 7 countries here, those being Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. Algeria has the highest Human Development Index here at 0.763, and Morocco has the lowest at 0.710. So quite a tight range of 0.053. Egypt has the largest GDP, and I'm sure you can guess why, at 347 billion. With a population of 109.5 million, the GDP per capita is roughly 3,100. Lebanon has the smallest GDP at 21.7 billion and a GDP per capita of about 4,000. So the countries in this range vary their GDP on population because the incomes are within a few thousand of one another. And if you didn't guess, services lead Egypt's GDP, and of course tourism is the largest share of that. Tourism is also quite large in Lebanon, but the real estate industry is actually the largest, which also makes services as a whole the largest share of the GDP. Since Lebanon is a Middle Eastern country geographically, we can take Libya as well, since it is one of the poorer and less developed countries in this region. Libya's largest industry is oil and gas, and the country holds some of the largest reserves in all of Africa. Let us now move on to West Asia. I think the countries that end in Stan are probably the most thought of here, but let's not forget those like Georgia and Azerbaijan, and I also put Mongolia here. Most of the countries here still land at high on the Human Development Index, though if you realized with our last region, the incomes are beginning to become quite small. Georgia has the highest HDI at 0.844, and is probably considered by most people to be at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Tajikistan is our lowest here, with a Human Development Index of 0.691. Bit of a fun country to name, Tajikistan. That is also another broad region, though, with a range of 0.153. Kazakhstan is quite a unique country, I think, as it has the largest GDP in this region at 300 billion, but it is also one of the sparsest countries in the world. And the economy relies pretty much on raw resource exports, with oil and gas leading the way. With an HDI of 0.837, Kazakhstan breaks from several trends seen across pretty much every other country. High HDI, relatively high GDP, but it relies on the primary sector of industry. The country is also above the world average of GDP per capita, though only slightly above it at 14,700. Kazakhstan is the 227th least populated country in the world out of 242. That also considers the list. This list considers dependencies like Macau of China and Greenland of Denmark, which the latter has the smallest population density in the world, and Macau, I believe, is the most densely populated country or dependency in the world. In terms of countries that have a sizable population, though, Kazakhstan is up, rather down there, with countries like Russia, Canada, and Australia. Okay, that's probably enough about Kazakhstan. Sorry, I just find that country particularly interesting. The smallest GDP in this region is Tajikistan, with a figure of 17 billion and a GDP per capita of 1,600. At least I got to say Tajikistan a few times, though. As for their largest industry, it is the aluminum industry. It might actually be the only country in the world that is true for. I'm not sure, but that is definitely high potential for that. I have an interest in aluminum, and the details behind this industry in Tajikistan are interesting to say the least. Tajikistan has no native aluminum ore, so I do not even know how the industry became so prominent, as processed aluminum exports reach 50% for the country sometimes. The plant that processes almost all of their aluminum is also the largest aluminum manufacturing plant in Central Asia, and one of the largest in the world. And it is run by the Tajik Aluminum Company, or Talco. Talco itself is completely managed by the president of Tajikistan, and hundreds of millions in revenue that are generated by Talco are routed to a shell company in the British Virgin Islands. There's one of our tax havens. This shell company is, of course, managed by the president as well. Another interesting fact is that Talco consumes around 40% of the entire country's electricity. Okay, sorry again, I went off on two tangents on two different countries now, but I figure some of you are perhaps starting to get a bit bored with the constant numbers, so maybe this stuff will interest you too. Southeast Asia can probably be considered our first medium-developed region, first and last. Remember, this includes Myanmar and Laos of the Indochina Peninsula. The other ones were in East Asia. We also have the Philippines, Indonesia, and most of the other island nations in the Oceania subregions of Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia, and the Indian subcontinent as well, with India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal, again minus Pakistan, and Sri Lanka as well. India is perhaps the country with the most interest here, and they share an HDI with Bangladesh at 0.685. Indonesia has the highest HDI at 0.728. Technically, Fiji and the Marshall Islands are higher, but as I've sort of been ignoring the island nations, I will continue to do so. Sorry about that, if you live there. It's not because they aren't important, it's because they're decidedly less important economically. And most people probably haven't heard a lot of them, about a lot of them, although Fiji is perhaps well known. Anyway, the country with the lowest HDI that I've included here is Cambodia, with a figure of 0.606. This is actually the lowest in this region, and there are some countries in Oceania that don't meet my arbitrary cutoff of 0.600 for this region. Anyway, as might be expected, the largest GDP in this region is India, at 4.125 trillion, which is fifth in the world. With the largest population in the world, however, at 1.428 billion, the GDP per capita is about 2,800. The only country in the world with a comparable population is China at 1.408 billion, with a GDP per capita of 13,800. Again, discounting island nations. Nepal has the smallest GDP at 45.5 billion, with a GDP per capita of about 1,500. The largest share of GDP in India is the services sector, interestingly enough, perhaps, although this is the information technology sector that leads this, so it's perhaps not so surprising. Services are also the majority share in Nepal, though. This is mostly due to tourism of the Himalayas, however. As Southeast Asia was our first and last medium HDI region, Sub-Saharan Africa is our only low HDI region. There are a significant number of countries that are still categorized as medium, but Sub-Saharan Africa has the most low HDI countries out of anywhere else. The majority of the 53 countries on the African continent itself, there actually might be 55 considered here, but most of the countries on the continent are considered low on the HDI, and Africa contains the only countries in the world that are below a 0.450 HDI. The region also contains the only country in the world below a 0.400 on the Human Development Index. That country is South Sudan, with an HDI of 0.388, and it's currently declining. It is the least developed country in the world by the standard of the Human Development Index. Somalia might also be below this figure, as it has not received a Human Development Report since 2022, and remember these are 2023 numbers, and it was declining before that. According to the United Nations, as of now, there are only 9 countries that are among the least developed countries in the world that are not in Africa. The other 30 or so are all in Africa. There are, however, some relatively well-developed countries in sub-Saharan Africa, with Eswatini leading the charge. You may know this country better as Swaziland, but in the past decade, the country has shot up 12 places on the Human Development Index, with a current figure of 0.695. Since this is a bit of an outlier, the next highest is Namibia with an HDI of 0.665. That gives us a range of 0.307, remember our lowest being South Sudan. So unless we discount Eswatini, though, then we have a range of 0.277, so still our largest range. The figures of GDP, of course, paint a similar picture. While the countries with the largest populations typically have the largest GDP figures, the GDP per capita is within a fairly tight range for all of sub-Saharan Africa. The country with the largest GDP and population is Nigeria, with respective figures of 285 billion and 236.7 million, making Nigeria the 6th most populous country in the world. The GDP per capita is only about 1,200. The country with the highest GDP per capita in all of this region is Botswana, with a figure of 7,000, though I wouldn't consider Botswana here because its HDI is quite a bit higher than the rest, as well with South Africa and Gabon, so I would rather put this in my grab bag, but just to give a little bit of perspective there. The smallest GDP in this region is Lesotho, with a figure of 2.4 billion. This makes for a GDP per capita of about 1,000. The smallest GDP might actually be Eritrea, but I do not have current figures from the IMF, so I can't be sure. The lowest GDP per capita in sub-Saharan Africa is also the lowest in the world, which perhaps predictably is South Sudan, at $313. The largest industry in Nigeria is the oil and gas industry, which commonly accounts for more than 90% of its export revenue. I would have discussed this in detail in episode 4. The case is the exact same for South Sudan, with upwards of 98% of export revenue coming from oil and gas. However, in Eswatini, in Swaziland, sugar production is the largest industry. I have not gone over every country in this region, but I believe almost every single one will have their top industry in the primary sector, since both the most and least developed countries in this region have that case. This final region here might take a while, since it isn't really a region at all. I am going to list all of the countries here, as well as most of the figures for HDI and GDP per capita, but I'm only going to give a few figures for total GDP and a couple prominent industries. This, if you guessed, is our grab bag. This is the collection of countries that are special enough in one way or another to not really fit into another region by my criteria. Most of these countries are fairly underdeveloped, as I said earlier, but we do have a few that are developing. The perhaps interesting thing is no country I've included here is considered developed, as they're all geographically close to at least another developed country. I'll start from the west and move eastward, as that's sort of reading our common map projections from left to right. Haiti is our first country, with a Human Development Index of 0.554 and a GDP per capita of about 2,400. That's the only country here in all of the Americas. Next, we have sort of the opposite case in Africa, since these three countries are somewhat more developed. We have Gabon and South Africa, and as I mentioned, in sub-Saharan Africa, we also have Botswana. Gabon and South Africa have Human Development Indices of 0.733 and 0.741, respectively, so quite close, and figures for GDP per capita of 9,300 and 6,667, respectively. And as I said earlier, Botswana has around 7,000. Palestine has a Human Development Index of 0.674 and a GDP per capita of about 2,400, so the same as Haiti. Iraq has a Human Development Index of 0.695 and a GDP per capita of 5,832. Afghanistan and Pakistan have Human Development Indices of 0.496 and 0.544, respectively, and figures for GDP per capita of 417 and about 1,700, respectively. Afghanistan has the second lowest GDP per capita in the world at $417. South Sudan, remember, was the lowest at 313. Papua New Guinea is the last country I'll mention, but be aware there are some other island nations in Oceania I would place here as well. Papua New Guinea has a Human Development Index of 0.576 and a GDP per capita of about 2,500. The largest nominal GDP here is South Africa with 426.3 billion. The smallest GDP is Palestine, which is about 13.7 billion. Some of the largest industries in these countries are the textile industry in Haiti, oil and gas in Gabon, also oil and gas in Iraq, agriculture in Afghanistan, and in Papua New Guinea it is either the oil and gas or the mining industry. I couldn't find a definitive enough answer for which was dominant, but we can assume both contribute a significant portion. I personally thought it might be fishing, or maybe agriculture, though, for the largest industry. I don't know what you guys would think. Now, in case that was too much, I'm going to give a quick super generalization of 5 regions in the world, kind of like a quick facts section, maybe. I would not recommend thinking about economic distributions like this, but perhaps it will help you. We'll do Germany for Europe, sort of the more of the Western world as a whole. Argentina for South America, in the Latin world as a whole. Mali for Africa, Thailand for Asia, and Saudi Arabia for the Middle East, or the Arab world as a whole. Again, as we went over extensively in this episode, there is just too much variation in these regions for this generalization to be accurate at all, but perhaps it will help as a summary of sorts or something. Germany has an HDI of 0.959, a GDP of 5 trillion, a GDP per capita of 60,000, and the largest sector of industry is in services. Saudi Arabia has an HDI of 0.900, a GDP of 1.26 trillion, and a GDP per capita of about 35,000, with the largest share of GDP in the primary sector, with oil and gas leading the charge, of course. Argentina has an HDI of 0.865, a GDP of 683.3 billion, a GDP per capita of about 14,000, and the largest sector of industry is in services as well. Thailand has an HDI of 0.798, a GDP of 558.5 billion, a GDP per capita of about 8,000, and the largest sector of industry is in services. And finally, Mali has an HDI of 0.419, a GDP of 25.5 billion, a GDP per capita of about 1,000, and the largest sector of industry is in the primary sector, with agriculture leading. Now, before I finish this episode, I would like to mention an alternate perspective one could categorize and analyze countries by. Perhaps the most well-known geographical index is the Human Development Index, but one that offers a different view on some countries is the Fragile States Index. This is not a very prominent index, but I think it's relevant and interesting nonetheless. The Fragile States Index is compiled by the Fund for Peace, which is a non-profit, non-governmental American institution. They describe a fragile state between a score of 0 and 10 on 12 different aspects spread across 5 categories. So the maximum score can be 0, or the maximum score can be 120, which means it's the most fragile, and the minimum score can be 0, which means it's the least fragile. I'll just quickly list all the aspects. I won't explain each so as to not spend too much time here, and hopefully we can get a sense as to how the countries are ranked then. Under cohesion is the security apparatus, factionalized elites, and group grievances. Under economics is economic decline and poverty, which parenthetically, I'm not sure why they don't have a separate aspect for poverty itself. But anyway, you also have uneven development and human flight and brain drain. That's one category, human flight and brain drain. Under political is state legitimacy, public services, and human rights and rule of law. Again, that's one, human rights and rule of law. Under social is demographic pressures and refugees or internally displaced persons. And under cross-cutting is external intervention. I don't know why there's a separate category for only one aspect, but don't ask me, I didn't come up with this. The lowest 3 that are ranked are, perhaps rather predictably, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan, with scores of 111.3, 109.3, and 109, respectively. For most of the delegations, countries land around where one might expect them to. But I mentioned an alternate perspective, so I'll give you the top 3 countries so we know what is there and what the scores are, and then I'll offer some rather surprising placements. Norway, Finland, and Iceland are decidedly the least fragile states, surprise, surprise, and they have scores of 12.7, 14.3, and 15.2, respectively. Now for some actual surprise, perhaps. Uruguay actually ranks above the United States, with scores of 33.7 and 44.5, respectively. The United States is ranked around less developed countries, on the HDI at least, such as Argentina, Barbados, and Croatia. One could probably point to either social or cohesive reasons for displacement. Remember, those aspects are of scoring and not like politically or opinionated social reasoning or something like that. Another perhaps surprising, perhaps not surprising one though maybe, is Russia, which has a score of 81.6, and that places it around far less developed countries, even in Africa, like Madagascar and Rwanda. Anyway, this episode is fairly long, hopefully not too dull, so I won't drag on about the FSI anymore. Just thought it would be interesting to offer a different perspective and than how I elected to categorize countries. Maybe the FSI would be an interesting episode, but again, I probably won't do one on that. I do hope you enjoyed this episode, though, as I myself love this kind of number, fact, quantitative information. Regardless, I'm quite excited for what I have planned for the next episode, so be on the lookout for that. If you did enjoy this episode, though, I would appreciate a positive review on the aggregator of your choice, like Spotify or Apple. You can also check out our Facebook page and leave a like or comment. You can also join our Discord from there. Or you can send an email to the show's email, fabricofindustry@gmail.com, if you prefer email communication. I've yet to receive one from a listener, and I am quite eager to do so, so please do that if you are interested in asking a question or even just saying hello. And as always, we'll talk in the next episode.